let me share my unpopular opinion that'll get me kicked out of every libertarian organization I've ever belonged to or had any
I may vouch
You
for
don't belong to one, so
I may vouch for you. So just, but please share.
Well, is that in the long term, what they're really talking about really is a Muslim ban. And in the long term, restricting Muslim immigration to the United States is a better policy. We have this tremendous dishonesty about this conversation saying, well, it's not about Muslims, it's about people from Libya, it's about people from Iran, it's about people from Iraq, it's about refugees from Syria and how they might be infiltrated. I don't really think that's it at all. I think it's an argument about the fact that the United States is not a country that has a large Muslim minority, and it's a country that doesn't want to develop a large Muslim minority. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable position. I think that there's a reason why you've got a lot more terrorism in Paris than you do in New York or in Washington, D.C., and it has to do with the characteristics of the population. The idea that having a large and often unhappy Muslim minority has security aspects attached to it would not be, I think, terribly controversial to politicians in Delhi or in Bangkok or in lots of other parts of the world. But we are, for various reasons, unwilling to have that conversation because it makes us uncomfortable, and it probably should make us uncomfortable. But I think at some point we should probably be honest about what the long-term intention here is, which I think is to discourage increasing immigration to the United States by Muslim people from the Middle East.
So, I mean, the sane, reasonable response to that, which is what you'll get here, is, well, I understand the argument you're making, but isn't it the case that the overwhelming majority of people who happen to be Muslim are not, in fact, a danger to anyone else?
Absolutely.
In which case, working particularly hard to sort of contain this subset of people is probably a mistake, because any number of really good, virtuous people are not able to come into the country. I've got another sort of philosophical argument that I wanted to.
Guilty,
yeah. So, I mean, is that the best way to go about it?
I think it is, actually. I think it's a more prudent decision. People will talk about this particular conflict and say these spasms and paroxysms in the Islamic world, which don't in the end actually have a lot to do with the United States. They have to do with Arab nationalism and Sunni Shia conflict and various other sorts of things.
And all sorts of underlying political situations.
Right. And we're not super good at sorting that stuff out. But we do have a tool at our disposal here, which we probably ought to use. And that is the fact that Islamic extremists need a relatively large minority population in which to work and recruit and hide and do their radicalization and all the rest of it. Even though you're talking about maybe a tiny, tiny little percentage of the population, and even though you're talking about putting the other large percent of the population in a terribly unfair and sometimes even inhumane situation where you're talking about the Syrian refugees, if the responsibility of the United States government is to the American people and not to people living in Syria and not to people in Pakistan, which I don't understand why it isn't on the list, or Saudi Arabia, which I don't understand why it isn't on the list as well.
Well, I mean, you do know why it's not on the list, though. Effectively, you know why in practice.
Saudi Arabia, I understand. Pakistan, less so.
The totalitarian countries with whom we have good relationships, who do things for us, we do not judge them particularly harshly or do bad things to them or tell them that they're bad actors publicly and embarrass them.
And that might have been true of Pakistan in the 1980s. It hasn't really been true of Pakistan in a long time, I don't think. We do actually have, crude as the policy tool is, a way to prevent that sort of situation from evolving in the United States, which is simply to limit ruthlessly immigration from that part of the world. And I don't think it's a bad policy. I don't think it's an unreasonable policy to take, even taking into account the horrifying consequences it's going to have for a lot of people around the world who don't deserve it.
I just think that we are different than France and Germany and England, and they are even better than some of the other countries in Europe when it comes to assimilation. I have an optimistic faith in the assimilation machine of the United States, even in the face of what I think some people don't want to acknowledge is a concentration of terrorism and threat coming from radical Islam in this country and all over the Western world. I don't look at Paris and see America. I've spent a lot of time in France, and it's very sad what has come there. I don't worry about that happening here to anything like the same degree. I think the people who come here have a much different journey of getting here, and I think one of the things that irritates me about the execution of this, the selling of it, the campaigning on it, it has been based on, I think, a few misnomers. One is that the refugee crisis in Europe is analogous to the refugee crisis here, or not the refughy crisis, the refugee admittance.
There isn't really one
here. The crisis is that we haven't had any refugees for the most part until, I mean, last year was the first year we had anything like any significant number of refugees from Syria,
and that was after like consistent years of like 10, 5, a dozen, 20. Under the Obama administration.
It's harder to get here. You have to cross an ocean. You actually have to go through the screening process. Donald Trump campaigned as if there wasn't a screening process, as if vetting what we don't know who these people are. He said over and over and over again. It's pretty hard to get in this country as a refugee from Syria when we don't know who you are, because we have some discretion there. You got to go in line, and part of that line, you're not prioritized if you don't have papers. We have a much bigger ability to pick and choose. Now, FBI Director Comey and some other people in Homeland Security have given presentations to Congress in which they said they're not satisfied with how stringent that is. And I respect that. Justin Amash, in an interview with me a year ago, and he's someone who's been very, very critical of this recent executive order, someone who's a son of a Palestinian refugee to the United States and a Syrian immigrant. He thinks that needs to be shored up a great deal. But to say that there's no
actual vetting process.
The vetting process, yeah.
Sure.
But to say that there's no vetting happening, or that what's eventually happening in the U.S. is analogous to what's happening in Western Europe, I think is wrong. And basing policy on that fear, I think, is also wrong. I think that the gap between the United States and Western Europe is actually going to get smaller the more we base our fears on Western Europe happening here. It's this the thing where I understand everybody's motivation in this game.
Yeah.
I'm setting aside Trump here because I don't want to think about him in general. But I understand the reaction of like, hey, we don't want terrorists in this country. That's a pretty normal reaction.
Do we think the evidence shows that we've done a good job screening and assimilating the Somalis who came to the United States, or a bad job?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't know.
I think the evidence shows that we've done a pretty bad job. They're largely unassimilated in places like Minneapolis, where you have a large population. My hometown, where I was born anyway, of Amarillo, Texas, which has the largest per capita refugee population in the country, has a very large Somali population there that's entirely unassimilated, unincorporated in anything like mainstream society there. It is a problem. We've, of course, had Somali Americans showing up, various jihadist organizations overseas, those sorts of things. I think people look at that example and conclude that we don't actually necessarily do a very good job with this. And my faith in the ability of American intelligence and law enforcement agencies to vet refugees and such
is it low, Kevin?
Is really quite limited, and here's why. Because every other mass shooting attack we've had in this country, in Orlando and others, you've had people who've been interviewed by the FBI 3 times.
Yeah.
Who have been, suspects in various cases, things like that. These are not just people who came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
These are people we had some good reason to be suspicious of. We did nothing. Because we're not really actually very good at doing that. We're not as efficient about these things as, say, the Swiss are, or even the Western Europeans, the other Western Europeans to some extent. So I think that we should probably not be unduly optimistic about the efficacy of the American public sector when it comes to these things.
I think that's a fair point. And I think it's also fair to just point out that yes, I don't have a great deal of confidence in them either. But they're also not really letting in many people and simply haven't been over the course of the last decade. So to the extent that there is a small trickle of people coming in from this part of the world, I am not terribly frightened. It would be terribly inconsistent for me to suggest that I have a great deal of faith in their ability to do this when we all have seen how ham-fistedly a program like the TSA has been implemented and how ineffective it's been. The leaked reports, because of course it's too secretive to tell us plainly that they simply suck at doing their job. But the leak reports that show us that 90+% of bomb-making materials and weapons have made it through some of the most important airports in the country through the screening process during the testing phase, not just in general, but the testing phase, testing procedures. That's kind of terrifying.
I'm not sure that's a great analog. Ultimately, I mean, it's not just some minimum wage.
I understand, but at the end of the day, it's a massive bureaucracy, and it is the sort of stuff that we saw happening at airports over the weekend, where people who are interpreting the orders that they're getting from the rest of the bureaucracy simply go about it in the wrong way. Where kids end up being detained for hours and hours and hours.
Interject.
There have been rumors of people in handcuffs.
All that.
I mean, this is an issue.
My faith is not in American bureaucracy. My faith is in American society, the stuff that happens. We are an assimilation machine, not because there's an office of assimilation. And I think on the Somali question,
but again, I think there's room for a note of caution there, in the sense that there are some reasons. I mean, every group has its own particular group characteristics, and Islamic societies have their own characteristics as well. And you can take the example of a very open and pluralistic society like India that has had centuries to really absorb and incorporate its Muslim minority, and so far has failed to do so and has terrible Islamic terror problems.
But I mean, Kevin, I don't think and we could sit on this for a while, and I don't necessarily want to, because I don't know how much progress we'll be able to make in the time allotted to us. But I don't think, I mean, there's a generalization there necessarily, right? When we talk about sort of the distinct characteristics of people who share a particular faith or who live in a particular area, I mean, we are generalizing in some pretty crude ways. And I mean, you even acknowledge like the limitations of a policy by which we say, well, look, I mean, there is a problem here. There is an overrepresentation amongst this particular group of folks in terms of the likelihood that they might participate in terrorist activities. We should be very cautious about that, and therefore perhaps we shouldn't allow a large minority of them to grow in this country. I mean, that is one way to go about trying to address the problem. It's not as though it isn't without its own potential unintended consequences.
And I would just add that there hasn't really been many groups of others who haven't been at some point targeted as unassimilatable in American life.
I'd say that's true too.
And in the long run, everyone got assimilated.
Yeah,
I can't think
of right about the Irish.
I mean, the Irish, if we could assimilate the Irish, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
If they could become cops in the third generation, that's kind of a remarkable thing. The Somali refugees have been kind of the pig in the python recently. They have been among the largest recent refugees here. So I don't know what the total kind of immigration curve is on that. It might be a case in which they are uniquely, this time these ones can't assimilate. It might also be a mix factor with they just came here and they're figuring it out too. I don't know.